So let's take the next step and talk about multiples and growth. And I want to spend a little bit of time with talking about multiples and growth. And let's look at this. This is just from the case, and I got to put my glasses on. And if we look at this, we see a few things to observe. First, that we have price PE, price to earnings, enterprise value to EBITDA, enterprise value to sales. So if I use this multiple, which is the PE ratio over here, key to understand that that PE ratio will give, if we take earnings times price, PE ratio, it gets us a value of equity. So here we get value. This is an equity multiple. This is an enterprise value multiple, and this is an enterprise value multiple. Okay, so just as, so we see these things, and if you look at them, there's quite a bit of variability. But typically we see that, let's look at the enterprise value to EBITDA multiples. They're much higher for the shoe companies than it is for these apparel companies. And we look over here, there's quite a bit of variability in what the EBITDA multiples are. But if we think about this is the 5-year compounded annual growth rate for the last 5 years. So this is for the last 5 years. I just combined this from the two exhibits. And what we see, there's quite a bit of variability in both the growth and also with regard to each one of these multiples. And so just to give some idea is the relationship between multiples and growth, what I did was this. What I did is I just plotted growth, which is this compound annual 5-year growth rate, against the multiples. And I put in a trend line. So if we look at 5-year growth rate for sales over here on this axis and the PE ratio on this end, I put in a trend line. And pretty much what we see is that as growth goes up, okay, this is historic growth, but as growth goes up, the multiples go up. Over here, when we look at growth and multiples, this is enterprise value with regard to EBITDA. We see exactly the same thing. There's a trend that as growth goes up, okay, this gives higher multiples. So also, same thing over here is when growth goes up, what we wind up with is higher enterprise value to sales. Now, this is a little bit misleading in a sense. It's not perfect. But because we're really talking about the last 5 years, this is the last 5 years growth rate, and I use that to plot. What I really would like to put here is not the last 5 years, but I'd like to put expected growth on this axis and not the last 5 years. This is historic, so it's the last 5 years. But if I did that, I pretty much would get a relationship with this. So basically, higher multiples. So basically, higher multiples imply higher growth. Okay, in fact, higher expected growth. So there's a one-to-one relationship. High growth firms have high multiples. Low growth firms tend to have lower multiples. All right, so. Okay, let's look at the exhibit in the case, which is multiples and growth. And what I've done here is, this is basically this. And what we see here is this is primarily footwear. And the PE ratios for primarily footwear are about, let's use enterprise value to EBITDA. It's about 15. If we go down here, primarily apparel, and the average for that across those is about 23. And if we look at this down here, for established name apparels, they're about 8. So basically, if we go back, we looked at growth, we find that on average, the growth rate for this is the highest. This is the average growth rate there is the next highest. The average growth rate here is the lowest. So basically, we see that these averages line up. And what I also did was calculate some multiples for Crocs based upon a price of $75 per share, and we wind up with a price earnings ratio, EV to EBITDA, and so those are sort of, if we just took like 2007, that's pretty outrageous in terms of what they're doing. And so what we need to do is to say, okay, if we want to value Crocs with multiples, okay, and I'm going to talk a little bit about doing that, we have to sort of decide what pot does it fit in, okay? Should it be primarily footwear, primarily apparel, or established apparel brands? So we have to make a decision. Where is it? Well, that's going to be a key determinant of our valuation of Crocs, because when I say what is it, I'm really saying is what are the appropriate growth rates for Crocs? And so let's sort of look at that and think about that. All right, let's look at the valuation model that we gave you in the case. Okay, so here's the valuation model, and I'm going to go back to an Excel version of this, but I'd like you to just sort of look at this a little bit. So basically, this model with all of these assumptions here, we get they got a stock price of $84.17. All right, so let's look at that, and let's go to the Excel model.